Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Most violent crimes don't announce themselves with sirens or screaming. They begin quietly, in the spaces we think are safest. Inside homes where promises were made. In relationships built on what we believed was love. Behind the badges and uniforms we're taught to trust without question. The stories you're about to hear aren't about monsters lurking in shadows. They're about ordinary people who ignored warnings, institutions that failed to protect, and trust that became deadly. Tonight, we'll walk through 5 cases that share a common thread. Each one began with someone believing they were safe. A woman who thought she'd found love after years of focusing on her career. A father working hard to provide for his family. A professional walking home after visiting a friend. A college student pursuing her dreams. A man trying to navigate a complicated divorce. All of them trusted the wrong person, or trusted too much, or found themselves failed by the very systems designed to protect them. This isn't entertainment. These are real lives that ended in violence. Real families left behind. Real communities forced to reckon with uncomfortable truths. We'll honor these victims not by exploiting their deaths, but by examining what went wrong and what could have been different. Because buried in each tragedy are warning signs that were dismissed, red flags that were ignored, and moments when intervention could have changed everything. The first case takes us to Coral Ridge, an affluent neighborhood in Sunnyvale where tree-lined streets and million-dollar homes suggest safety and success. It was a place where people knew their neighbors, where children played in front yards, where crime felt like something that happened somewhere else. Amara Patel had worked hard to build a life there. In her late 30s, she'd founded a successful tech startup that specialized in data security, a field where she'd made a name for herself through intelligence and determination. Her colleagues described her as brilliant but approachable, someone who could explain complex technical concepts in ways anyone could understand. But success in business hadn't translated to success in her personal life. Her marriage had ended 2 years earlier, a quiet dissolution that involved lawyers and paperwork, but little drama. She'd thrown herself into being a mother to her 8-year-old son, attending every school event, helping with homework at the kitchen table, reading bedtime stories even on nights when work had exhausted her. Friends noticed she rarely talked about dating. When they'd suggest she should get back out there, she'd smile and say she was happy focusing on her son and her company. The truth was more complicated. After the divorce, she'd felt a wariness about relationships, a sense that she'd lost time and needed to be more careful about who she let into her life. When she finally decided to try online dating, it was with careful deliberation. She chose platforms that catered to professionals, filled out her profile honestly, and approached potential matches with the same analytical mindset she brought to business decisions. Most first dates were pleasant but forgettable. Coffee that lasted exactly an hour. Dinners where conversation flowed easily but chemistry didn't spark. She wasn't discouraged. She told her best friend that she was fine being selective, that rushing into something new would be a mistake she couldn't afford to make. Then she met Lucas Reedman. His profile suggested someone who matched her ambitions, someone who understood what it meant to build something from nothing. He claimed to come from generational wealth but had struck out on his own, investing in international ventures that took him around the world. His photos showed a man in his early 40s, well-dressed but not ostentatious, standing in front of landmarks that suggested both success and adventure. Their first conversation lasted 3 hours. He asked thoughtful questions about her company, seemed genuinely interested in her son, and shared stories about his own travels that felt exciting without being boastful. Their second date was dinner at a restaurant where he'd somehow secured a reservation that normally required weeks of planning. He remembered details from their first conversation, asked follow-up questions that showed he'd been listening. When she mentioned her son liked astronomy, he talked about a trip to Chile where he'd visited observatories in the Atacama Desert. He made her laugh. More importantly, he made her feel seen in ways she hadn't felt in years. By the time dessert arrived, she was already imagining introducing him to her son, already thinking about what it might be like to have a partner again. The relationship accelerated quickly. Within 6 weeks, he was staying at her house most nights. Within 3 months, He'd suggested moving to Sunvale permanently to be closer to her. He claimed he could work from anywhere, that his investments were managed by teams he trusted, that being tied to one location had been holding him back from what mattered most. She was flattered by the gesture, touched that someone would uproot their life for her. When he proposed after 5 months, she said yes before fully processing the question. Her friends were surprised by the speed, but happy for her. Her son seemed to like Lucas, who brought him books about space and played video games with him on weekends. The wedding was small, held in her backyard with close family and friends. Lucas's side was notably sparse. He explained that his parents had passed away years ago, that he was an only child, that most of his relationships were business contacts scattered across continents. It made sense given what he'd told her about his life. She didn't push for details. Looking back, she would wonder why she hadn't asked more questions, why she'd accepted his explanations without verification, why red flags had seemed like minor inconsistencies rather than warnings. The first real crack appeared during discussions about renovating the house. It was something she'd been planning before they met, updating a kitchen that hadn't been touched since the house was built in the 90s, adding a home office that would give her a proper workspace. She had architects' drawings, contractor quotes, a clear vision of what she wanted. Lucas took an immediate interest, suggesting changes, proposing upgrades, insisting they could do better than her modest plans. He wanted to expand the renovation to include the entire first floor, to add a second story, to transform the house into something more befitting their combined success. She was hesitant about the scale and cost. He was persuasive. He talked about investment value, about creating a home that would grow with them, about not thinking small when they had the resources to think big. More importantly, he offered to manage the entire project. He had connections with contractors, he said. He understood construction from his various real estate investments. He could negotiate better prices than she'd been quoted. All she had to do was trust him. So she did. She signed papers giving him authority to make decisions about the renovation. She transferred money into joint accounts he'd set up for the project. She stepped back and let him take control. The renovation started with demolition. Walls came down. Floors were torn up. The house became a construction site. Lucas assured her it was normal, that things had to get worse before they got better. Weeks passed. The work seemed chaotic rather than purposeful. Contractors came and went at odd hours. Some looked professional. Others seemed questionable, showing up in unmarked trucks, working without permits, doing jobs that didn't match the plan she'd approved. When she asked Lucas about it, he became defensive. He accused her of not trusting him. He reminded her that she'd asked him to handle this. He suggested that her need for control was what had probably contributed to her first marriage falling apart. The comment stung. She backed off. But privately, she started documenting things. She took photos of the work being done. She kept copies of receipts and invoices that didn't make sense. She began writing in a journal, recording conversations, noting discrepancies between what Lucas told her and what she observed. The house had become unlivable. They moved into a rental property, supposedly temporary while the renovation was completed. Her son struggled with the disruption, asking why they couldn't just go home, why everything was taking so long. She had no good answers. Lucas promised it would all be worth it. He showed her pictures of what the house would look like when finished. He talked about hosting dinner parties, about creating memories in a space they'd built together. She wanted to believe him, but the money kept disappearing. The accounts he'd set up for the renovation were being drained faster than the work progressed. When she asked to see detailed budgets, he produced documents that didn't add up. When she pressed harder, he accused her of undermining him. He said she was making him feel like a failure. He wondered aloud whether she'd ever really trusted him or if she'd been waiting for him to prove her doubts right. The arguments became frequent. He would storm out of the rental house, sometimes not returning until the next day. He stopped talking about the renovation's timeline. He started talking about how ungrateful she was, how she didn't appreciate everything he was trying to do for their family. She confided in her best friend that she was thinking about separation. The friend was supportive but worried. She'd noticed changes in Amara over the months since the wedding. The confident woman who'd built a successful company had become uncertain, second-guessing herself, apologizing for things that weren't her fault. The friend urged her to talk to a lawyer, to protect her assets, to make sure her son's well-being was the priority. Amara agreed. She started making quiet inquiries, researching divorce attorneys, gathering financial documents that Lucas didn't know she'd copied. She wrote in her journal that she felt trapped, that she'd made a terrible mistake, that she needed to find a way out before things got worse. She never got the chance. On a Tuesday evening in late September, emergency services received a call from Lucas. His voice was panicked, his words tumbling over each other. He said there'd been an accident. He said Amara had fallen in the bathroom. He said she wasn't breathing. He said he'd tried to help, but didn't know what to do. The paramedics arrived within minutes. They found Amara in the master bathroom of the rental house, lying on the floor in a position that didn't match a simple fall. There was blood. There were signs of trauma that couldn't be explained by slipping on a wet floor. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Lucas's story began falling apart immediately. He claimed he'd been in another room when he heard a thud. He said he'd rushed in to find her collapsed. He said he'd called for help right away, but the timeline didn't work. The injuries didn't match his account. And when investigators began looking into his background, they found that nothing about Lucas Riedman was what he'd claimed. There was no generational wealth. There were no international investments. His name appeared in connection with financial fraud in 3 other states. The man who'd swept Amara off her feet with stories of success and adventure was a con artist who'd targeted her specifically, researching her online presence, crafting a persona designed to appeal to her, gaining her trust for the sole purpose of accessing her money. The renovation had been a scam. The contractors were associates who'd helped him drain her accounts while doing minimal actual work. The house wasn't being improved. It was being destroyed deliberately, making it harder for her to return, keeping her dependent and disoriented. When she'd started questioning things, when she'd begun gathering evidence and planning to leave, he'd seen his scheme collapsing. The prosecution would later argue that he'd killed her to prevent her from exposing him, to avoid criminal charges, to buy time to disappear with whatever money remained. The defense tried to maintain that it was an accident, that Lucas had found her injured and panicked. But the physical evidence was damning. The forensics showed that Amara had been struck multiple times. She'd fought back. She'd tried to defend herself. Lucas Riedman was arrested 3 days after Amara's death. He maintained his innocence through months of legal proceedings. But the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records traced the path of Amara's money into accounts he controlled. Communications with his associates revealed the calculated nature of his deception. And perhaps most damning, investigators found the journal Amara had been keeping, documenting her growing awareness that something was wrong, her fear of what might happen if she tried to leave. She'd written just 2 days before her death that she was scared, that Lucas had become unpredictable, that she was worried about her safety. She'd written that she needed to be smart about her exit, that she couldn't let him know she was planning to leave. She'd written that she hoped she was being paranoid, that maybe things could still be fixed. Her last entry simply said she'd made up her mind. She was going to file for divorce that week. The trial took nearly a year to begin, delayed by various legal motions and Lucas's attempts to suppress evidence. When it finally proceeded, Amara's family and friends filled the courtroom every day. They listened to testimony about how she'd been deceived, how her kindness had been exploited, how her desire for companionship had been weaponized against her. Her son, now being raised by his biological father, would grow up knowing his mother had been murdered by a man she'd trusted enough to marry. The house in Coral Ridge, the home where she'd built a life and raised her child, sat abandoned and half demolished, a physical monument to betrayal. Lucas was convicted on charges of murder and fraud. The judge, in delivering the sentence, noted that this wasn't a crime of passion but a calculated execution designed to cover up months of financial abuse. Lucas received life in prison without possibility of parole. He showed no remorse during sentencing. Even in his final statement, he maintained that Amara's death had been an accident, that he'd loved her, that he was being wrongly convicted. No one in that courtroom believed him. Amara Patel's death serves as a stark reminder that financial abuse is a form of violence, that love can be faked by those with malicious intent, and that warning signs, no matter how subtle, should never be ignored. The second case takes us across the country to Pine Creek County, a rural area where families had lived for generations and everyone knew everyone else's business. Marcus Hale grew up there, attended the local high school, and never had any desire to leave. He worked at a manufacturing plant 20 miles outside town, a job that paid decent wages but required long hours and hard physical labor. He was in his late 20s when he married Danielle Cross, a woman 5 years younger who'd grown up in the same area but had always dreamed of a different life. Her social media profiles were filled with images of luxury she didn't possess, captions about goals and manifestations, and the life she believed she deserved. Marcus knew about her ambitions. She'd been honest that she wanted more than Pine Creek County could offer. But he loved her, and he thought love would be enough. They started having children quickly, for kids in 6 years, and with each birth, the financial strain increased. Marcus took extra shifts at the plant. He missed family dinners and school events because he was working to keep up with bills. Danielle stayed home with the children, increasingly frustrated by the reality of her life. The house they rented was small. Money was always tight. The luxury lifestyle she posted about online was entirely fictional, carefully staged photos that hid the clutter and chaos of their actual circumstances. Friends noticed the tension between them. Marcus seemed exhausted, worn down by trying to provide for a family while his wife complained that he wasn't doing enough. Danielle seemed angry, resentful of being stuck in a life she hadn't wanted. She told people that Marcus was controlling, that he kept her isolated, that she was trapped. But neighbors saw something different. They saw Marcus working himself to exhaustion while Danielle spent hours on her phone, curating an image of a life that didn't exist. They saw him come home tired and be met with complaints rather than gratitude. They saw him with the kids while she was out with friends, claiming she needed breaks from the stress of motherhood. The marriage deteriorated rapidly. Arguments became constant. Danielle started telling people that Marcus was abusive, though she never provided specifics and refused to involve authorities. She'd mention it casually to friends, dropping hints about being afraid, saying just enough to plant seeds of doubt about Marcus's character without making formal accusations. When people asked if she needed help, if she wanted to talk to police or go to a shelter, she'd backtrack. She'd say it wasn't that bad, that she could handle it, that she didn't want to break up the family. Looking back, those who heard these claims would realize she was building a narrative, creating a version of events that would serve her later. What nobody knew was that Danielle had begun reaching out to people with criminal backgrounds. She'd found them through social media, through mutual acquaintances, through connections that would only make sense later when investigators traced her digital footprint. Her initial plan involved framing Marcus for drug possession, planting evidence that would get him arrested and give her grounds for divorce with custody of the children. She researched how police conducted searches, what would be believable, how to make it look like he'd been dealing to supplement his income. But that plan evolved into something far darker. The people she'd contacted weren't interested in a simple frame job. They saw opportunity in her situation, particularly in the life insurance policy Marcus had through his employer. It wasn't a massive policy, but it was substantial enough to make murder worth discussing. The conversations, later recovered from encrypted messaging apps, showed how Danielle went from wanting Marcus out of her life to actively planning his death. She justified it by continuing to claim abuse, by painting herself as a victim who had no other options, by convincing herself and her conspirators that she was acting in self-defense against future violence that hadn't occurred. Marcus had no idea what was being planned. He kept working his shifts, kept trying to be a good father, kept hoping his marriage could somehow be saved. He talked to his own family about maybe getting counseling, about wondering if he could work fewer hours and spend more time at home, about wanting to understand why Danielle seemed so unhappy. His mother would later testify that he'd been worried about his wife's mental health, that he'd been encouraging her to see a therapist, that he'd been trying everything he could think of to make things better. The last conversation she had with her son, he told her that he loved Danielle despite everything, that he was committed to their family, that he believed they could work through their problems. The night of Marcus's murder was planned with cold calculation. He finished his shift at the plant, texted Danielle that he was heading home, and drove his usual route through the dark rural roads of Pine Creek County. He never made it. A vehicle forced him off the road 3 miles from his house. When he got out to check the damage, he was grabbed by 2 men. They beat him savagely, breaking bones, rupturing organs, making sure he understood he was dying before they finally shot him. They loaded his body into a truck and drove to a piece of remote land that Danielle had scouted earlier. They dumped him in a shallow grave and covered him with dirt and branches. Danielle's performance when Marcus didn't come home was Oscar-worthy. She called his phone repeatedly, leaving voicemails asking where he was. She called his workplace, his friends, his family. She reported him missing to the police, crying as she explained that he'd never just not come home, that something must be wrong. She posted on social media asking for help finding her husband, sharing his photo, begging anyone with information to come forward. For hours, she played the worried wife perfectly. She even suggested that maybe his work stress had gotten to him, that maybe he'd needed to clear his head, that she hoped he was safe wherever he was. But then she made a critical mistake. While police were still treating Marcus's disappearance as a missing person case, while search parties were being organized and officers were following up on tips, Danielle staged a home invasion. She claimed that men had broken into her house, that they'd been looking for Marcus, that they'd threatened her and the children. The story was elaborate, detailed, designed to create an alternate narrative where Marcus had been involved in something dangerous, something that explained his disappearance. But the physical evidence didn't support her claims. There were no signs of forced entry. Neighbors hadn't heard or seen anything unusual. And when investigators examined her electronics, they found the communications with her co-conspirators. The unraveling was swift and brutal. Phone records placed her in contact with both men who'd killed Marcus in the hours before his disappearance. Financial searches showed she'd been researching how insurance payouts worked, how long it took for someone to be declared legally dead, how much money she could expect. Surveillance footage from a gas station showed one of the conspirators fueling up his truck near the location where Marcus's body would later be found. And then someone talked. One of the men involved, facing the reality of spending life in prison, decided to cooperate with prosecutors. He gave them everything: the planning discussions, the timeline of the murder, the location of Marcus's body, and most damaging, he provided recordings of conversations with Danielle where she discussed payment, timing, and the cover story she planned to use. Marcus Hale's body was recovered from that remote piece of land 3 weeks after his death. The autopsy revealed the extent of the violence inflicted on him. He'd been conscious during much of the beating. He would have known he was going to die. The thought of his final moments, understanding that this was how his life would end, that he'd never see his children again, that his wife had orchestrated his murder, is almost unbearable. His family demanded answers. They demanded justice. And they got some measure of both, though nothing could bring Marcus back or undo the trauma his children would carry forever. The trials were separated, with the 2 men who actually carried out the killing tried first. Both were convicted quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. They received lengthy sentences that ensured they'd spend most or all of their remaining lives in prison. But everyone was waiting for Danielle's trial. That was where the real story would come out, where her manipulation and lies would be exposed, where she'd have to face what she'd done. The prosecution built a meticulous case. They showed the jury her social media posts, the false image she'd been projecting, the growing gap between her fantasy life and reality. They showed the messages where she plotted with the killers. They showed her internet searches about insurance money and how to report someone missing. They showed the fake home invasion and how poorly she'd staged it. Danielle's defense tried to argue that she'd been abused, that everything she'd done was out of fear, that the murder had been planned by the men without her knowledge. But the evidence contradicted every claim. Neighbors testified that they'd never witnessed Marcus being violent or controlling. His co-workers described a man who was gentle and hardworking, who talked about his kids constantly, who seemed devoted to his family despite obvious marital problems. Medical records showed Danielle had never sought treatment for injuries or reported abuse to any healthcare provider. The prosecution demonstrated that her claims of abuse had only emerged after she'd already started planning Marcus's death, that they were justifications rather than reasons, excuses constructed to make herself feel better about murder. The jury deliberated for less than a day, guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge was unsparing in his assessment. He noted that Danielle had taken the father of her 4 children, that she'd planned his death with calculation and carried out that plan without remorse, that she'd tried to profit from his murder while pretending to grieve. He sentenced her to multiple consecutive life terms, ensuring she'd never see freedom again. Danielle showed no emotion during sentencing. She didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge what she'd done. She simply stared ahead as the judge delivered her fate. Marcus Hale's children are being raised by his parents now. They're too young to fully understand what happened, but someday they'll be old enough to ask questions. Someday they'll have to reckon with the fact that their mother murdered their father, that she chose money over family, that she weaponized false claims of abuse to justify the unjustifiable. The community of Pine Creek County was shaken by the case. It forced uncomfortable conversations about how readily people believe accusations without evidence, about how someone can present one face to the world while plotting murder behind closed doors. The third case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about authority and the institutions we trust to protect us. Lily Warren lived in Northbridge, a district in South London known for its mix of Victorian terraces and modern apartments, where young professionals and longtime residents shared streets and local pubs. She was in her early 30s, working in communications for a non-profit organization focused on environmental issues. Friends described her as thoughtful and engaged, someone who actually lived the values her organization promoted. She biked to work when weather permitted. She volunteered at community gardens on weekends. She was the person who remembered birthdays and organized gatherings, who checked in when someone seemed down. On a Wednesday evening in March, Lily visited a friend who lived about 40 minutes away by foot. It was a pleasant walk through familiar neighborhoods, the kind of journey she'd made dozens of times. They'd had dinner, talked about work and relationships, and plans for the summer. She left around 9:30, planning to be home before 11. The route took her through well-lit streets, past businesses that stayed open late, through areas where she'd never felt unsafe. She texted her friend when she was about 20 minutes from home, confirming she'd gotten away safely and thanking her for dinner. That was the last normal communication Lily Warren would ever send. What happened next would expose systemic failures that had been years in the making. Officer Grant Holloway was on patrol that night, driving through Northbridge in a marked police vehicle. He'd been with the Metropolitan Police for over a decade, a career that had been marked by concerning incidents that somehow never resulted in serious consequences. There had been complaints from women about his behavior during traffic stops. There had been reports of him abusing his authority, of making inappropriate comments, of conduct that should have triggered investigations. But each time, the complaints were dismissed or downplayed. He was given warnings. He was moved to different assignments. He was allowed to remain in uniform, carrying the authority of the law, trusted because of his badge. Holloway stopped Lily on a quiet street 3 blocks from her flat. The exact nature of what he told her will never be fully known, but witnesses later reported seeing a police officer talking to a woman who appeared cooperative but confused. She wasn't resisting. She wasn't arguing. She was doing what most law-abiding citizens do when stopped by police, complying with instructions, trusting that the person in uniform had legitimate reasons for the interaction. Holloway claimed he needed to verify her identity. He claimed there had been reports of suspicious activity in the area. He claimed he was following standard procedures. All of it was lies, but Lily had no way of knowing that. She got into his police car, believing she was being taken to a station for routine questioning that would be cleared up quickly. She never made it to any police station. Holloway drove her away from populated areas, away from cameras and witnesses, to a location where he could do what he'd been planning. The details of what happened to Lily are too graphic and disturbing to recount in detail, but she was subjected to horrific violence before being killed. Her body was hidden, and Holloway returned to his regular duties as though nothing had happened. He filed false reports about his activities that evening. He continued patrolling. He went home to his own family. He acted like a normal police officer doing a normal job, all while knowing exactly what he'd done. Lily's disappearance triggered immediate alarm among her friends and family. She wasn't someone who just vanished. She was reliable, responsive, always checking in. When she didn't show up to work the next morning, when she didn't answer calls or messages, people knew something was catastrophically wrong. Her friend, the one she'd visited the night before, contacted police to report her missing. She provided the timeline, the last text message, the route Lily would have taken home. Police began investigating, but in those crucial early hours, they had no idea that one of their own officers was responsible. The investigation eventually focused on Holloway through a combination of witness statements and technological evidence. Someone had seen a police car in the area where Lily disappeared. Traffic cameras captured his vehicle at times and locations that didn't match his official reports. Cell phone data placed him in areas he shouldn't have been. As investigators dug deeper, the full picture of his activities that night emerged. He'd stopped Lily under false pretenses. He'd abused his authority to gain her compliance. He'd murdered her and hidden her body. And he'd done all of this while in uniform, while on duty, while being paid by taxpayers to protect the community. When confronted with the evidence, Holloway initially denied everything. Then, as the case against him became undeniable, he changed tactics. He claimed it had been consensual. He claimed she'd agreed to get in his car. He claimed things had gotten out of hand, but it wasn't murder. Every version of his story was a lie, an attempt to minimize his culpability, to avoid the full weight of what he'd done. The evidence told the truth. Forensic analysis of his police vehicle revealed Lily's DNA. His phone records showed internet searches about how to avoid detection, how to dispose of evidence. And eventually, her body was recovered from the location where he'd hidden her, confirming the worst fears of everyone who loved her. The case became a national flashpoint. Protesters filled the streets, demanding accountability not just for Holloway, but for the system that had enabled him. Because this wasn't a case of one bad officer acting alone. This was the result of years of ignoring warning signs, of treating complaints against Holloway as minor issues rather than patterns of predatory behavior. Women had tried to sound alarms about him. They'd filed official complaints. They'd reported his conduct to supervisors. And each time, the institution had protected him rather than protecting potential victims. The Metropolitan Police faced intense scrutiny. Internal reviews revealed dozens of officers with similar patterns of misconduct complaints that had never resulted in termination or prosecution. Vigils were held for Lily across the country. Her photo, showing a smiling woman with kind eyes, became a symbol of the cost of institutional failure. Her family, while grieving, became vocal advocates for reform. They demanded changes to how police complaints were handled, how officers with repeated misconduct allegations were disciplined, how the system could be restructured to prioritize public safety over protecting bad cops. Her father gave an interview where he broke down describing how his daughter had trusted the police, how she'd complied because she believed the system worked, how that trust had been weaponized to destroy her. Grant Holloway eventually pleaded guilty, sparing Lily's family the trauma of a trial. His guilty plea came only after his defense team made clear that taking the case to trial would result in even harsher sentencing, that no jury would show mercy to a police officer who'd murdered someone in his custody. The judge, in accepting the plea, noted that Holloway's crimes represented a profound betrayal of public trust, that he'd used his position of authority to facilitate murder, that he'd damaged the relationship between police and community in ways that would take generations to repair. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole, the maximum penalty available under British law. But no sentence could undo what had happened. Lily Warren's life had been stolen by someone who was supposed to protect her. Her death exposed how systems designed to serve and protect can become enablers of violence when accountability is lacking, when complaints are dismissed, when institutional preservation is prioritized over public safety. The reforms that followed her death, changes to complaint procedures and oversight mechanisms, came too late for Lily, but might prevent future tragedies. Her legacy became one of forcing uncomfortable conversations about authority, about who we trust and why, about the price communities pay when institutions fail. Our fourth case brings us to a college campus, a place that should represent opportunity and growth, but where young people navigating new independence and complex relationships can find themselves vulnerable in ways they don't anticipate. Lakeshore University sat beside one of the Great Lakes, a mid-sized school known for its nursing program and its tight-knit community feel. Norah Blake had chosen it specifically for the nursing program, drawn by the high passage rates for licensing exams and the emphasis on hands-on clinical experience. She was in her early 20s, a junior when the events of this case unfolded, known among her classmates for her empathy and her dedication to becoming a pediatric nurse. She'd grown up in a small town where everyone knew everyone, where her parents were respected members of the community, where she'd been homecoming queen and valedictorian and every parent's example of a good kid. College had been her first real taste of independence, and she'd embraced it carefully. She studied hard, maintained strong grades, volunteered at the local children's hospital on weekends. She made friends easily, drawn to people who shared her values and work ethic. Her roommates would later describe her as someone who brought light into every room, who could make you feel better just by listening, who genuinely cared about people in ways that seemed increasingly rare. Norah met Evan Morales during her sophomore year. He was a year older, studying business, with aspirations of eventually running his own company. Their relationship began as a friendship, study sessions in the library that turned into coffee dates that evolved into something more. For the first few months, it seemed healthy. Evan was attentive, interested in Norah's goals, supportive of her demanding academic schedule. He'd bring her food during late-night study sessions. He'd quiz her on medical terminology. He'd talk about their future together, about building a life that supported both of their careers. Norah's friends liked him initially. Her parents, when they met him during a campus visit, thought he seemed nice enough. But gradually, things changed. Evan became possessive. He wanted to know where Norah was at all times, who she was with, why she hadn't responded to his texts immediately. When she had study groups with male classmates, he'd show up unannounced, claiming he was just in the area, making everyone uncomfortable with his presence. When she tried to spend time with friends without him, he'd accuse her of not prioritizing their relationship. He started tracking her location through her phone, demanding explanations for any deviation from her normal routine. Norah found herself walking on eggshells, trying to balance keeping him happy with maintaining her own life. Her friends noticed the changes in her. She seemed anxious, constantly checking her phone, making excuses for Evan's behavior. When they expressed concern, she'd minimize it. She'd say he was just stressed about school. She'd say he came from a difficult background and had trust issues. She'd say she understood where he was coming from even as his behavior escalated. Looking back, her roommate would tearfully recount how many times she'd urged Norah to end the relationship, how Norah would agree that things weren't healthy but then stay anyway, caught in the cycle that traps so many people in toxic relationships. The breaking point came when Norah decided to study abroad for a semester. It was part of her nursing program, a clinical rotation in a developing country that would provide invaluable experience and look impressive on her resume. She was excited about the opportunity, had been planning for it for over a year. When she told Evan, his reaction was explosive. He accused her of trying to escape him. He said if she really loved him, she wouldn't leave. He threatened to hurt himself if she went. When those tactics didn't work, when Norah held firm that she was going, he shifted to anger. He told her the relationship was over if she left. He said she was choosing her career over him, that she was selfish and cold. Norah called his bluff. She told him that if he felt that way, maybe they should break up. It was a moment of clarity, a recognition that his attempts to control her had crossed lines she couldn't ignore. She ended the relationship and threw herself into preparing for her study abroad program. Her friends were relieved. Her parents were proud that she'd prioritized her future. For a few weeks, it seemed like she'd made the right decision. Evan left her alone, stopped texting and calling, seemed to accept that it was over. Norah started to relax, to feel like herself again, to look forward to her future without the weight of his jealousy and control. But Evan hadn't accepted anything. He was planning. His social media posts from that period, recovered later by investigators, showed someone spiraling into obsessive thoughts. He wrote about betrayal, about people who use you and discard you, about the unfairness of women having all the power in relationships. He interacted with online communities that reinforced his sense of victimhood, that told him he was right to be angry, that suggested women like Norah needed to be taught lessons. His friends, if asked directly, would have said he seemed off, that he was saying concerning things, that maybe someone should talk to him. But nobody did. The warnings were there, clear as day to anyone paying attention, but they were dismissed as just a guy going through a breakup, nothing serious. 3 weeks before Norah was scheduled to leave for her study abroad program, Evan messaged her asking if they could talk. He claimed he'd accepted the breakup but wanted closure, wanted to understand where things had gone wrong, wanted to part as friends if nothing else. Norah was hesitant. She talked to her roommate about whether she should meet with him. Her roommate advised against it, said nothing good could come from giving him more access, said he'd already shown he couldn't be trusted. But Norah, ever empathetic, felt like she owed him a conversation. She felt guilty about how happy she was to be free of the relationship. She wanted to make sure he was okay, that he wasn't going to do something self-destructive. So she agreed to meet him at his apartment on a Thursday evening when her roommate would be out of town. She texted her best friend before going, saying she was meeting Evan briefly, that she'd check in within an hour, that if she didn't respond, to call. It was a precaution she took because some part of her was uneasy, some instinct warning her that this might not be safe. But she went anyway, believing she could handle an awkward conversation, believing Evan deserved the closure he claimed to want. Norah Blake never left that apartment alive. When she didn't check in after an hour, her friend tried calling. The calls went to voicemail. Text messages went unanswered. The friend, increasingly frantic, contacted campus police. They went to Evan's apartment and found Norah dead. She'd been strangled during what the medical examiner would later determine was a prolonged assault. The scene suggested she'd fought back, that she'd tried to escape, that she'd spent her final moments in terror. Evan was gone. His car was missing. His phone was off. He'd murdered Norah and fled. The investigation revealed that Evan had been planning this for some time. His internet search history showed queries about how to commit murder and avoid detection, about whether strangulation left evidence, about countries without extradition treaties. He'd withdrawn money from his bank account in the days before the murder. He'd told his roommates he was going on a family emergency trip, setting up an excuse for his absence. Everything pointed to premeditation, to a calculated decision to kill Norah because if he couldn't have her, nobody would. The romantic notion of a crime of passion didn't apply here. This was an execution carried out by someone who decided that Norah's autonomy, her right to end a relationship and pursue her own dreams, was an offense punishable by death. Campus security footage tracked Evan's movements after the murder. He'd left his apartment, driven to a remote area outside town, and attempted suicide by drug overdose. When that failed, he'd driven to the airport and caught a red-eye flight to Mexico. From there, he'd traveled to several countries, using money he'd saved and credit cards he maxed out, staying just ahead of authorities for nearly 3 weeks. But international law enforcement cooperation eventually caught up to him. He was arrested in Southeast Asia, in a hostel frequented by backpackers, looking nothing like the clean-cut business student who'd murdered his ex-girlfriend. He'd grown a beard, lost weight, and according to the hostel owner, spent his days drinking and his nights unable to sleep. Extradition took months. Evan fought it at every stage, claiming he wouldn't get a fair trial in the United States, claiming he was innocent despite overwhelming evidence, claiming Norah's death had been an accident that happened during an argument. His defense attorneys tried various strategies, but none could overcome the forensic evidence, the premeditation revealed in his search history, or the fact that he'd fled internationally immediately after the murder. When he was finally returned to the United States, he was met by Norah's family, who'd been waiting for this moment, who wanted him to see their faces and know that Norah had been loved, that her death had shattered a family, that he'd taken something irreplaceable. The trial was conducted with Evan appearing remotely from jail, a security measure given his suicide attempt and flight risk. Norah's family attended every session, sitting in the front row, holding photos of her, making sure the jury never forgot that this case was about a real person with dreams and potential. The prosecution presented the evidence methodically. They showed the jury Evan's controlling behavior during the relationship. They showed his reaction to the breakup and his online activity afterward. They showed his search history, his financial preparations for fleeing, and the physical evidence from the crime scene. They demonstrated that this wasn't a moment of lost control, but a planned execution of a young woman whose only crime was wanting to live her own life. Evan's defense tried to argue that he'd loved Norah, that he'd been devastated by the breakup, that emotions had overwhelmed him. But the evidence of premeditation made that narrative impossible. You don't research murder techniques and plan international flight because you're overwhelmed by emotion. You do those things when you've decided to kill someone and escape the consequences. The jury took less than 2 hours to find him guilty of first-degree murder. Additional charges related to his flight and attempts to evade justice were also upheld. At sentencing, Norah's parents spoke. Her mother described their daughter's compassion, her dedication to helping others, the children she would have cared for as a nurse. Her father spoke about the hole in their family that would never heal, about the grandchildren they'd never have, about holidays that would always be marked by Norah's absence. Evan was given life in prison without possibility of parole. Even at sentencing, he didn't take full responsibility. He offered a vague apology that focused more on his own pain than on what he'd done to Norah. He talked about how the breakup had hurt him, how he'd felt abandoned, how things had spiraled out of control. He never acknowledged the fundamental truth that Norah had every right to end their relationship, that her autonomy was not negotiable, that his feelings, however intense, gave him no claim to her life or her death. The judge, in delivering the sentence, specifically addressed this. He noted that Evan's sense of entitlement, his belief that Norah owed him something simply because they dated, was at the root of this tragedy. He noted that this attitude, prevalent in certain communities and reinforced by certain ideologies, was dangerous and had led directly to Norah's murder. Lakeshore University implemented new policies in the wake of Norah's death. They created better reporting systems for relationship violence and stalking. They mandated training for students and staff on recognizing warning signs. They established protocols for handling situations where students felt threatened by current or former partners. But these changes, necessary as they were, couldn't bring Norah back. Her parents channeled their grief into advocacy, speaking at colleges across the country about the dangers of possessive relationships, about the need to take jealousy and control seriously, about empowering young people to trust their instincts when something feels wrong. They established a scholarship in Norah's name for nursing students, ensuring her dream of helping others would continue through those she inspired. The fifth and final case brings us full circle to a theme present in many of the stories we've discussed tonight. Betrayal within families, the spaces where we should be safest, is perhaps the most devastating form of violence because it destroys our fundamental sense of security and trust. Redstone City was a mid-sized community in the Mountain West, known for its outdoor recreation and sense of neighborliness. Daniel Frost had lived there most of his adult life. In his early 40s, he worked for a nonprofit organization that provided services to homeless youth, a job that paid modestly, but that he found deeply meaningful. Colleagues described him as dedicated and empathetic, someone who genuinely cared about making a difference in vulnerable young people's lives. Daniel's marriage to Melissa had ended several years prior, a divorce that had been initiated by mutual agreement when they'd both realized they'd grown into different people with incompatible goals. It had been as amicable as divorces can be, with shared custody of their 2 teenage children and a working relationship focused on co-parenting. What made their situation unusual was that they continued living together in the family home. Financial realities and a desire to minimize disruption for their children had led them to this arrangement. They maintained separate bedrooms, separate lives in many ways, but shared the daily rhythms of household management and parenting. Friends thought it was strange, but admired their commitment to putting the kids first. What Daniel didn't know was that Melissa had moved on romantically in a way that would prove deadly. She'd begun a relationship with Caleb Turner, a man she'd met through work. Caleb was younger than Melissa by nearly a decade, with a spotty employment history and a string of failed relationships behind him. What he saw in Melissa wasn't just romance, but opportunity. She owned half of a house. She had life insurance policies that listed her as beneficiary if anything happened to Daniel. She was dissatisfied with her financial situation and open to discussions about how to improve it. Caleb saw all of this and began planting ideas about how much better her life could be if certain obstacles were removed. The relationship between Melissa and Caleb escalated quickly from affair to conspiracy. Text messages recovered later would show how Caleb manipulated Melissa's frustrations, turning complaints about living with her ex-husband into discussions about what she'd do with the house if it was just hers, turning concerns about money into calculations about insurance payouts. Melissa, for her part, was receptive to these discussions. She'd grown resentful of Daniel, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because his presence was a constant reminder of a marriage that had failed, of a life that hadn't turned out how she'd imagined. She wanted a fresh start, and Caleb convinced her that the only way to truly move forward was to eliminate Daniel entirely. The planning took months. They researched methods, discarding ideas that seemed too risky or too likely to be detected as homicide. They settled on staging Daniel's death to look like suicide, specifically a shooting followed by a fire that would destroy evidence. Melissa quietly updated insurance policies, increasing coverage amounts and making sure she was the primary beneficiary. She created a paper trail of concern about Daniel's mental health, texting friends and family members with vague worries about whether he seemed depressed, whether work stress was affecting him, whether they thought he was okay. She was building a narrative that would explain his supposed suicide, creating plausible doubt before the murder even occurred. Daniel noticed none of this. He was focused on his work, on being present for his children during a difficult stage of adolescence, on maintaining the peace in his complicated living situation. He had no reason to suspect that his ex-wife, the woman he'd once loved enough to marry, the mother of his children, was plotting his murder with her secret boyfriend. He trusted that their divorce had been handled maturely, that they'd both moved on, that the unusual arrangement of still living together was working well enough for everyone. That trust would be his undoing. On the night of the murder, Daniel came home from a late shift at his nonprofit job. His children were with friends, a sleepover that Melissa had encouraged, making sure they wouldn't be home. Melissa was supposedly out for the evening. The house was dark when Daniel pulled into the driveway. He was tired, looking forward to a quiet evening, maybe watching something on television before bed. He had no idea that Caleb was waiting inside, that Melissa was parked down the street monitoring the timing, that his last moments of peace were ticking away. The sequence of events, later reconstructed by investigators, showed cold-blooded execution. Daniel entered through the garage as he always did. Caleb confronted him in the kitchen, armed with a gun that Melissa had purchased weeks earlier using a private sale that didn't require background checks or registration. There was a brief struggle. Daniel, realizing what was happening, tried to defend himself, but he was taken by surprise, and Caleb had the advantage of planning and weaponry. Daniel was shot twice, once in the chest and once in the head. He died quickly, but not instantly. He spent his final seconds understanding that he'd been betrayed, that this was murder, that he'd never see his children again. Caleb worked quickly after that. He dragged Daniel's body to the living room and positioned it to look like a self-inflicted shooting. He wiped down surfaces to remove his fingerprints, though he missed some spots that would later prove crucial. Then he set multiple fires throughout the house, using accelerants to ensure the blaze would spread quickly and burn hot. The idea was that the fire would destroy evidence of staging, that Daniel's death would be attributed to suicide followed by accidental fire caused by candles or some other innocent source. Caleb fled the scene, meeting Melissa at a predetermined location, both of them believing they'd committed the perfect crime. But perfect crimes rarely exist outside of fiction. The fire department responded quickly to 911 calls from neighbors who'd seen flames. They managed to contain the blaze before it completely consumed the house. Daniel's body was recovered, and immediately, things didn't add up. The positioning seemed off. The angle of the gunshot wounds wasn't consistent with suicide. And when arson investigators examined the scene, they found clear evidence of accelerant use in patterns that suggested intentional setting rather than accidental spread. This wasn't a suicide followed by tragic fire. This was murder and arson, staged poorly by people who'd watched too many crime shows and thought they were smarter than investigators. The investigation moved quickly once homicide was confirmed. Detectives looked at Daniel's life, his relationships, his financial situation. They found no indicators of suicidal ideation. His co-workers were shocked by the suggestion he'd kill himself, noting he'd been his usual positive self the day of his death. His friends said the same. His children, when gently questioned, said their father had seemed fine, that they'd been making plans for an upcoming camping trip, that he'd shown no signs of despair. Everything pointed to a man content with his life, not someone contemplating suicide. The focus shifted to Melissa almost immediately. The updated insurance policies raised red flags. Her texts to friends about Daniel's supposed mental health struggles seemed performative when investigators looked at the timeline, all of them sent after the policies were updated. And then surveillance footage from the night of the murder showed her car parked on a street with a clear view of her own house, sitting there for hours during the time frame when Daniel was killed. When detectives obtained her phone records, they found she'd been in contact with someone that evening, exchanging messages at times that corresponded with the murder and fire. That someone was Caleb Turner. His phone records placed him at Melissa's house at the time of the murder. His financial records showed Melissa had been giving him money, supporting him, with promises of much more to come once the insurance paid out. And when police searched his apartment, they found clothing with accelerant residue, the same chemical composition found at the fire scene. They found internet search history about how to stage suicides and avoid arson detection. They found handwritten notes calculating insurance payouts and discussing how to split the money. Caleb and Melissa had been sloppy, overconfident, and now they were caught. Confronted with the evidence, Caleb broke quickly. He gave a full confession, describing the planning, the execution, Melissa's role in everything. He tried to paint himself as manipulated by her, as someone who'd been used and discarded, but the evidence showed equal participation. He'd been a willing participant motivated by greed and the promise of a relationship with a woman who seemed to offer financial security. His confession gave prosecutors everything they needed to build an airtight case against both conspirators. Caleb pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and arson in exchange for testimony against Melissa and a sentence of life with possibility of parole after 30 years. It was a deal that ensured he'd spend most of his remaining life in prison, but gave him a small window of hope that Melissa would never have. Melissa maintained her innocence through the arrest, arraignment, and into the trial. She claimed Caleb had acted alone, that she'd known nothing about his plans, that she was a victim of his obsession and manipulation. But the evidence was overwhelming. Her own texts and emails showed planning discussions. Her insurance policy updates couldn't be explained away. Her presence near the house during the murder was damning. And Caleb's testimony, detailed and consistent with physical evidence, destroyed any remaining credibility her denials might have had. The jury saw through her lies. They saw a woman who'd conspired to murder her ex-husband for money, who'd prioritized greed over her children's right to have their father, who'd shown no remorse even when confronted with the devastation she'd caused. Daniel Frost's children lost both parents in one night. Their father was murdered. Their mother was revealed as his killer. The trial forced them to hear details about how their father died, about how their mother had plotted his death while maintaining the appearance of normalcy, about how she'd sent them away for a sleepover so they wouldn't witness the crime. The psychological damage to these young people is incalculable. They were placed with Daniel's parents, moving to a different state to start over, but no fresh start can erase the trauma of what happened. They'll carry this for the rest of their lives. The knowledge that one parent killed the other, that family betrayal can be this complete and devastating. Melissa was convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and arson. At sentencing, Daniel's parents spoke about their son, about the man he'd been, about the work he'd done helping vulnerable youth, about the love he'd had for his children. They spoke about how Melissa's greed had destroyed not just Daniel, but an entire family structure, how her actions had traumatized children who'd already been through the difficulty of divorce, how there was no punishment severe enough for what she'd done. The judge agreed. He sentenced Melissa to life in prison with possibility of parole only after serving 50 years. She'd be in her 90s before even being considered for release. She would spend virtually all of her remaining life behind bars, paying for a crime motivated by nothing more profound than wanting money and a fresh start, without the inconvenience of a divorce settlement. The house on Willow Lane, partially destroyed by the fire, was eventually demolished. The property sat empty for years, a reminder to the neighborhood of what had happened there, of the violence that had occurred behind walls that had once housed a family. Daniel's nonprofit organization established a memorial fund in his name, ensuring the work he cared about would continue. His children, as they grew older, would have to decide how to remember both their parents, how to reconcile love for a mother who'd committed an unforgivable act, how to honor a father who'd been stolen from them by betrayal. As we reach the end of these 5 stories, patterns emerge that connect them despite their different circumstances and settings. Amara Patel trusted a man who presented himself as successful and caring, but was actually a con artist willing to kill to protect his scheme. Marcus Hale worked himself to exhaustion for a family, while his wife plotted his murder with criminals she'd recruited online. Lily Warren complied with a police officer's instructions because she trusted the uniform and the authority it represented, not knowing she was being led to her death by a predator the system had protected despite repeated warnings. Norah Blake showed compassion to an ex-boyfriend who'd used that compassion to lure her to her murder, unable to accept that she had the right to end their relationship and pursue her own dreams. Daniel Frost maintained a cooperative relationship with his ex-wife for the sake of their children, never suspecting she was planning to murder him for insurance money. In each case, warning signs were present. Amara documented her growing concerns about Lucas's behavior in a journal, but she didn't share those concerns widely enough or soon enough for intervention to occur. Marcus's friends noticed Danielle's false claims of abuse, but didn't know how to respond when she wouldn't involve authorities or seek help. Lily's killer had a documented history of misconduct complaints that should have resulted in his removal from duty long before he had the opportunity to murder. Norah's friends saw Evan's controlling behavior and urged her to stay away, but she met with him anyway out of a sense of obligation and empathy. Daniel's ex-wife's sudden concern about his mental health should have seemed suspicious given their history, but people assumed she was being thoughtful rather than building a narrative for murder. These warning signs were dismissed for different reasons in each case. Sometimes it was because victims themselves minimized the danger, wanting to believe the best about people they trusted or loved. Sometimes it was because institutions prioritized their own reputations over public safety, as happened with the police department that ignored complaints about Holloway. Sometimes it was because observers didn't want to interfere in what seemed like private matters, respecting boundaries even when those boundaries protected abusers. And sometimes it was because the warning signs seemed small individually, only obvious as a pattern when viewed in retrospect after tragedy had already occurred. The question these cases force us to confront is what could have been different. Could Amara have been saved if she'd shared her journal entries with friends or family who might have helped her leave safely? Could Marcus have survived if someone had taken Danielle's criminal connections seriously and alerted authorities? Could Lily be alive if the police department had fired Holloway after the first credible complaint instead of moving him between assignments? Could Norah have avoided meeting Evan if campus security had taken his stalking behavior seriously and issued a no-contact order? Could Daniel have protected himself if he'd known about Melissa's affair and insurance policy updates? The honest answer is that we can't know for certain. Hindsight gives us clarity that wasn't available to the people living through these situations. But what we can say with certainty is that violence doesn't appear without precursors, that abuse and danger build gradually, that there are almost always opportunities for intervention before tragedy becomes inevitable. The challenge is recognizing those opportunities in real time, taking warning signs seriously even when they seem minor, prioritizing safety over politeness or institutional reputation or the desire to believe the best about people. These stories aren't meant to make you paranoid or unable to trust anyone. Most people are not violent. Most relationships do not end in murder. Most police officers are not predators. But within the general safety of everyday life, there are individuals who will exploit trust, abuse authority, use intimacy as a weapon, and plan violence while maintaining appearances of normalcy. The ability to recognize these individuals, to take action before they can harm, to build systems that protect potential victims rather than enabling abusers, is how we prevent tragedies like the ones we've discussed tonight. If you're in a relationship where you feel controlled, where your partner tracks your movements or isolates you from friends and family, where minor disagreements escalate to intimidation or threats, that's not love. That's abuse, and it can escalate to lethal violence. Trust your instincts. Reach out to friends, family, or domestic violence organizations. Make a safety plan. Document what's happening. You deserve to live without fear, and leaving is possible even when it feels impossible. If someone you care about is in a relationship that concerns you, speak up. Express your worries. Offer support. Sometimes an outside perspective can help someone recognize what they've been minimizing or denying. If you encounter authority figures whose behavior seems wrong, report it. Don't assume someone else will handle it. Don't trust that institutions will police themselves without external pressure. Accountability requires vigilance from communities, from citizens willing to speak up when they witness misconduct, from media and advocacy groups willing to investigate when official channels fail. The systems designed to protect us only work when we demand they function properly, when we refuse to accept excuses for failures that cost lives. Remember Amara Patel, who worked hard to build a successful company and provide for her son, whose trust was weaponized against her by a con artist who saw her as nothing more than a mark to exploit. Remember Marcus Hale, who worked exhausting hours to support his family while his wife plotted with criminals to murder him and collect insurance money. Remember Lily Warren, who was walking home through familiar streets when a police officer abused his authority to abduct and kill her. Remember Norah Blake, whose empathy and compassion were used to lure her to a meeting where her ex-boyfriend strangled her because he couldn't accept her autonomy. Remember Daniel Frost, who maintained a cooperative relationship with his ex-wife for their children's sake, while she and her boyfriend planned to murder him for financial gain. These weren't just victims. They were people with families who loved them, with dreams they were pursuing, with contributions they were making to their communities. Their deaths weren't inevitable tragedies, but preventable murders that occurred because warning signs were ignored, because systems failed, because trust was betrayed. We honor them not by turning their stories into entertainment, but by learning from what happened, by committing to recognize warning signs in our own lives and communities, by building a culture where violence is prevented rather than merely punished after the fact. If this video has made you think differently about trust, about relationships, about authority, about the importance of listening to instincts and taking warning signs seriously, then these stories have served their purpose. Before you go, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating content that examines these important cases with the respect and depth they deserve. Leave a comment below about where you're watching from, what time it is, and whether these stories have changed how you think about safety and trust. Share this with someone who might benefit from hearing these cases and understanding the patterns that connect them. These lives were not lost in silence. They were lost because too many warnings went unheard, too many red flags were dismissed, too many systems failed to protect when protection was needed most. But we can choose to listen now, to learn from these tragedies, to create a world where the next person in danger finds help before it's too late. Trust your instincts. Take warnings seriously. Demand accountability from institutions and individuals. Listening can save lives, and awareness is the first step toward prevention. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay safe and stay aware.